This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. There was a lot of discussion about the appropriateness of the Mekaymis that we're visiting now, especially to come out into Torah during the 3 weeks and during the 9 days. But actually, what could be more appropriate than to go to the spot, which is the subject of one of the most stirring and moving of the Kinnis, Kinnim Membeis, written by the Maram of Rothenburg, Rav Meir of Rothenburg, who wrote the Kinnas, Shali Srufa Ba'esh. So you could stand here in the streets of Paris, and it seems like a busy city, but the stones of Paris are crying out for the burning of the Talmud that occurred in the year 1242. The king of France at the time was King Louis IX. He's known as Saint Louis, not for his righteousness, but rather for his zealousness against Jewish people, and especially the favor he showed that to Jewish apostates. There was one such Jewish apostate by the name of Nicholas Donan, who was especially vicious to his former co-religionists. He himself personally caused the baptism of 500 Jews of Anjou and Poitiers, which is a rarity in French Jewry, because rarely did Jews of France convert. This was something that we read about in Spanish Jewry, but to have Jews in France convert, and the majority of Jews, 3,000 in all, converted, were murdered al Kiddush Hashem. Now, this is very important. Nicholas Donan, the apostate, realized something that even we don't see clearly. Namely, what is the backbone of the Jewish people? The backbone of Klal Yisrael is Talmud Bavli, is the Babylonian Talmud. And therefore, he made formal accusations to Pope Gregory IX that the Talmud contains passages heretical to Christianity. The Pope ordered all the copies of the Talmud to be confiscated. And March 3rd, 1240, while the Jews were in Shul, all the copies of Shas in Paris were confiscated. On June 12th, there was a public debate held between Nicholas Donan and 4 of the most eminent rabbis of the time, including Rabbi Hillel of Paris, Rav Moshe of Kusi. Anybody know who's Rav Moshe of Kusi? The Smag. And the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Now, the Talmud would have been burnt immediately if not for the one friend we had in the court, and that is the Bishop of Sens, who tried to defend the Talmud. However, immediately, the Bishop of Sens convulsed in a grotesque death right in front of King Louis, and the monks convinced King Louis that this was a heavenly punishment for him defending the Shas, and the king then put into the burning of the Shas into motion. 1,200 manuscripts of the Talmud were condemned to be burned, and you have to understand this is 200 years before the advent of the printing press. One volume of Shas could take many, many years to write, including works of Rishonim, Kisveyat of Rishonim, that because they were burnt, they were never again recovered. And the burning of the Shas occurred Erev Shabbos, Parshas Chukas. And they made a She'elas Chaloim, as I'm sure many of us are familiar with. And they asked via the heavens why this occurred. Was this in fact decreed from the heavens? And they received the following 3-word response: Da, Gezeras, Oiraisa, which is the Targum on Parshas Chukas, and still till today, many Yidden fast Erev Shabbos, Parshas Chukas. However, what's very interesting, and which really caused us to think, is that even though they received this supernatural response, that this was a heavenly decree, Rabbi Hillel of Verona stood here in 1242, and he was watching this, and he recognized that this was not an isolated occurrence, that there was actually a reason for this, and that is because a few years earlier, there was a great debate between the Rambam and the rabbis of northern France. The rabbis of northern France were vehemently opposed to the works of the Rambam, especially the Mar Nevuchim, the Sefer Hamada, and they made a formal accusation against the works of the Rambam. Now, the sages of Provence, many of them agreed with the Rambam, but there were a few sages that were very anti the Rambam, most notably Rav Shlomo Menahar, Rav Shlomo of Montpellier. and Rabbeinu Yonah himself. And there was a formal accusation against the works of the Rambam. And right here in this square, only a few years earlier, they burnt the works of the Rambam. So in 1242, when they burned the Shas, the ashes of the burnt Shas mixed with the ashes of the Rambam. And therefore, says Rav Hillel of Verona, it is clear this was not an isolated incident, that the burning of the Shas was heaven standing up for the honor of Rabbeinu Moshe ben Maimon. Now, the one thing we need to think about is how is this consistent with the message they received from heaven that it's a chayk, dag zera saraisa, that there's no reason for this, that it's a mystery, it's like a paraduma, and yet Rav Hillel of Verona is saying there's a clear reason for it. It's a punishment, quid pro quo, mida keneged mida, for the burning of the works of the Rambam. And we see from here a very important principle, that even when the Chachamim give reasons for Jewish tragedy, that's not the full reason. It doesn't make it fully comprehensible. There's still an element of mystery, an element of chayk, an element where we have to abandon our seichel and recognize this is gzeira min hashamayim. And this is an important principle whenever it comes to Jewish tragedy. Be it the paraduma itself. We know the paraduma is a chayk, and yet Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan from Narbonne, from the south of Spain, provided a reason for the paraduma. But it doesn't mean it's not a chayk. And even in those who attribute reasons for the Holocaust, that doesn't mean that we understand it, that it's comprehensible. Ultimately, we have to recognize Nistara Darkei Hashem and Kiloi Machshavoisai Machshavoiseichem. So, in only 2 weeks on Tisha B'Av, when you say Kinam Mem Beis, remember you stood here opposite Notre Dame by the hotel, the Deville, the what? Hotel Deville. And we stood here, what?
Beit Ha'iriya, Hotel
Beit
Ha'iriya.
Ha'iriya.
The city hall.
Dov.
The city hall, actually.
Again.
This building...
And we'll remember the tragedy that we stood at this moment, and we ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Shali Srufa Veish, to take up the vengeance of Terasenu HaKadosha. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.